judge, in no uncertain terms, said that that was not the correct behavior and that he threatened to preclude Sean Diddy Combs from being inside of the courtroom for possibly the duration of his own trial if he continued to look at the jurors and nod and react in any way to testimony that was coming in. This was a really big moment, of course, for the judge to make this statement. He is on trial, of course, fighting for his life, could spend the rest of his life in prison.
The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. One moment, Diddy was just sitting quietly, and the next, the judge's gavel slammed down with an explosive warning. What did Diddy do to provoke such a reaction? And how could something this small risk his entire case? Stick around to find out the critical misstep that almost got him thrown out.
Room Subramanian said to Mark Agnifilo, one of Sean Combs' defense counsel's defense attorneys, Mr. Agnifilo, your client was looking at jurors and nodding vigorously. This can't continue, or I will give a limiting instruction you won't like, or other measures, including barring your client from the courtroom. Do you understand? And Agnifilo responds, yes.
There was a major moment just now inside of the Diddy trial. While the jury had left the room, the judge had a conference with the actual attorneys, at which point the judge said, I was so clear this morning to Mr. Agnifilo, who is the lead counsel, I was so clear this morning there were not to be any reactions to this jury. There were not to be any theatrics. Was I or was I not clear? Mr. Agnifilo said that they were clear about it. He then admonished Sean Diddy Combs, the defendant in this RICO trafficking and prostitution case, that he had been nodding at the jury. He had been looking straight at the jurors. The judge, in no uncertain terms, said that that was not the correct behavior and that he threatened to preclude Sean Diddy Combs from being inside of the courtroom for possibly the duration of his own trial if he continued to look at the jurors and nod and react in any way to testimony that was coming in. This was a really big moment, of course, for the judge to make this statement. He is on trial, of course, fighting for his life, could spend the rest of his life in prison if he is convicted of all 5 charges. The judge said he expects this not to happen again, that the defendant in his case would look at the jurors, would nod, or in any way react.
Sure. Here's a rewritten version of your courtroom scene with clearer structure, pacing, and tension while preserving the dramatic tone and key events. The courtroom was packed, every seat occupied by reporters, spectators, and legal experts, all drawn to the spectacle of Diddy's high-profile trial. An electric tension filled the air, thick and still, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Every glance, every movement was under scrutiny. At the center of it all sat Diddy. Dressed sharply, but maintaining a reserved presence, he sat, rigid at the defendant's table, the weight of the proceedings visibly pressing down on his shoulders. As the judge entered, the low hum of whispered conversations faded instantly. All eyes turned to the bench, anticipation rising. What began as a routine day in court suddenly turned on its head with a single subtle gesture. Midway through testimony, Diddy glanced toward a few jurors and gave a small, nearly imperceptible nod. At first, it seemed innocuous, perhaps a sign of confidence or appreciation, but any ambiguity vanished the moment the judge reacted. The sharp crack of the judge's gavel echoed like a thunderclap across the courtroom. Everything froze, fixing. Their gaze on the defense table, the judge's voice cut through the silence, firm, unwavering, and unmistakably serious. Diddy was addressed directly. Any form of communication with jurors, the judge reminded, no matter how small or seemingly benign, was strictly prohibited. In a courtroom, even the slightest gesture, a smile, a glance, a nod, can be interpreted as an attempt to influence. The rules exist to protect the sanctity of the trial and ensure an impartial verdict. And in a case as public and polarizing as Diddy's, the perception of fairness is just as critical as the reality of it. The judge's admonition sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Attorneys shifted uneasily. Reporters scribbled furiously. Spectators whispered behind raised hands. The calm, focused atmosphere had been replaced by a palpable sense of unease. Diddy's legal team leaned in immediately, speaking to him in hushed, urgent tones. Their strategy now required adjustment. The judge hadn't gone as far as declaring a mistrial or removing Diddy from the courtroom, but the warning was loud and clear. One more misstep, and the consequences would escalate. More than just a rebuke, the moment reshaped the dynamic in the room. Diddy had been cast into a different light. His attorneys would need to reassess. And for the jurors, however impartial they might strive to be, the image of the defendant acknowledging them lingered. Would they interpret the nod as a humanizing gesture, a silent plea, or something more calculated? That split-second interaction may have seemed minor, but in the high-stakes world of courtroom drama, even the smallest act can echo loudly. The trial had already been intense, but now, with every move under heightened scrutiny, the pressure had reached a new peak. Could a simple nod jeopardize the entire case? That answer remained uncertain. But one thing was clear. After that moment, the stakes for Diddy had never been higher.
On the stand was saying that he believed that this date or the date of the incident had occurred in late September, specifically September 25th or September 26th. But as the defense pointed out towards the end of their cross-examination, Sean Combs and even Cassie in some aspects.
We've been asked a lot whether or not Sean Combs is participating in his defense. If you see him talking to his attorneys, passing notes, telling them what to ask, are you seeing any of that?
Oh, absolutely. Every single day. And, I have this kind of phrase to myself where it feels like Sean Combs, aka Diddy, is really kind of quarterbacking his own defense team. It seems like, from what I can see of him, he's always jotting down notes. He's always paying close attention to, the exhibits, but also what the witnesses are saying. So, for example, when Vanna was on the stand and Vanna was asked under cross-examination whether or not she worked on the Bad Boy reunion tour, I saw Diddy just nodding his head along while Nicole Westmoreland was asking this line of questioning. So I don't know if that was just kind of a candid moment that he was having, but there are times where I see him, one, actively participating in his defense, but also kind of answering the questions that the defense attorney is asking, but to the witness and not himself. And so he is an active participant in his defense. There is no passiveness with him being on that defense table, not one bit.
The judge's reaction wasn't just firm. It was a sharp and immediate assertion of authority in any courtroom. The judge acts as both referee and gatekeeper, ensuring that every aspect of the trial adheres to strict rules. They wield immense power, not just over the courtroom's proceedings, but over the narrative itself. In Diddy's case, the breach of protocol could not go unchecked, and the judge made that clear with a no-nonsense rebuke. Their gavel strike wasn't for show, it was a direct signal that Did's actions weren't just frowned upon, but could jeopardize the very structure of the trial. The severity of the warning wasn't lost on anyone. The judge laid out the stakes in plain terms. If Diddy repeated the gesture or did anything that could be interpreted as an attempt to sway the jury, more serious consequences would follow. This wasn't an empty threat. Judges have the authority to charge disruptive behavior with contempt, or in extreme cases, even remove the defendant from the courtroom entirely. For Diddy, that would have been catastrophic if removed. He would miss critical moments of testimony and lose the ability to assist his defense team in real time. It wasn't just about courtroom decorum, it was about strategy. This wasn't the first time a high-profile case saw a defendant nearly derail their own trial with subtle actions. In one widely reported case, a defendant in a political corruption trial was warned after repeatedly glancing at jurors during breaks. Something the defense later argued was completely innocent. Yet even instances like that are enough to make judges step in and maintain a clear divide between jurors and defendants. The rules exist to preserve fairness and jury tampering, whether deliberate or perceived strikes at the heart of what makes the judicial system credible. As the judge issued the warning, an undeniable shift rippled through the room. The attorneys at the prosecution table maintained a professional air, but their glances between one another hinted at an internal reaction. Was this their opportunity to play on Diddy's perceived lack of respect for courtroom rules? The jury, too, had suddenly become the focus not just of legal arguments, but of subtle, unintended theatrics for the audience in the gallery. It was another reminder of how unpredictable even the most straightforward legal proceedings can become the risk. For Diddy wasn't just the possibility of being reprimanded again. It was also the message this moment sent to the jurors. Would they see his nod as an overstep, perhaps even as reckless or arrogant? In celebrity trials where the world is watching, public figures are scrutinized at every level, and jurors are not immune to the weight of what they observe. Legal experts agree that the smallest misstep can snowball, especially when dealing with someone as well-known as Diddy. Courtroom behavior sends signals, intentional or not, and those signals can stick. By the time the judge finished speaking, the courtroom was left quieter, tighter, and more on edge. The warning wasn't just about making an example of Diddy. It was a reset button pressed in real time, telling everyone, both the defendant and the legal team, to operate with more discipline. For Diddy's side, the challenge was now clear. This trial wouldn't simply hinge on arguments and evidence. Every movement, every gesture, and every choice moving forward would be placed under a microscope. How would his team rise to the occasion?
Photographs, such as just text message exhibits, and the fashion that we normally do. Why? Because the government says there's so much redaction that needs to be done. So in these text messages, they kind of showed Jane's personal information as far as concerning her family members, and as far as concerning what could be identifiable information that could possibly help release her name out into the public. And they definitely don't want that, especially after what had happened to Mia. And so the government was saying that they can release the photos and the videos that don't depict Jane, and they can easily be released, possibly even the same day. But as far as her text and those photos that do show her face, do show identifiable features, those will take a little bit more, or take a little bit longer of a time to just redact those. And so the media organization, kind of legal representative, was saying that the government should have redacted these exhibits before she had testified, or before she testifies today. The media organization also saying that the press has a right and needs to see these exhibits, and delayed access is not effective access. And so what the judge ended up ruling is that he did end up siding with the government in this part, and that the media application to see these exhibits, even if it was just certain members of the press to see these exhibits, that application was denied.
We have seen it, of course, with theatrical and particularly disruptive defendants who are told to calm down or not to be theatrical in the way they are presenting to the jury to sway them. I've also heard it if the judge believes that somehow the conduct of the defendant might possibly influence or intimidate the jurors in this case, direct eye contact or otherwise. But to have this particular reaction in this high profile of a case, when a defense is well-versed in the appellate process and knows full well that anything that the judge orders their defendant and client not to do, if a conviction results, could very well go up on appeal. And of course, you've got the common sense notion. Imagine, if you will, the hypothetical, if you were accused of a horrendous crime, and the jurors will naturally, as human beings, look to the defendant for some human reaction of any kind. If one is not provided, there could be some adverse inference drawn for that jurors. And so if you are a defendant, it is a human instinct to react. The judge, however, has a very tight leash on this trial, including the attorneys and beyond. This was a moment that I have not seen where Sean Diddy Combs, who is normally stoic, looking ahead, has been threatened. If he reacts and looks at the jury and nods along with the testimony in an effort to try to persuade them on his own thoughts, he could possibly not be present for his own criminal federal trial.
Here's a refined and rewritten version of your piece, preserving the depth, tone, and complexity while enhancing clarity, rhythm, and emotional resonance. The warning hung in the air like static electricity, tense, charged, impossible to ignore. Diddy's defense team understood immediately. They had to act fast. The judge's sharp rebuke hadn't just interrupted the day's proceedings, it had shifted the entire energy of the courtroom. What was once focused and composed was now tense and fragile, and it was up to the attorneys to pull things back on course. For a defense team with everything at stake, this moment wasn't just about diffusing tension. It was about damage control, about making sure a brief, seemingly innocent gesture didn't leave a permanent stain on the jury's perception of their client. Every second counted now. Though the defendant's table had fallen silent, an undercurrent of urgency pulsed beneath the surface. Diddy's lawyers huddled close, whispering in clipped, urgent tones. Their body language was unmistakable. Swift, pen strokes, tightly drawn brows, and a shifting of strategy in real time. Rebuilding credibility became priority one. This wasn't just a legal challenge, it was an optical one. How this moment was framed, how it was felt, could matter just as much as the legal handling. Every courtroom has its own rhythm, its own delicate balance of performance and precision. Diddy's team now had to restore both. As for Diddy himself, the judge's words clearly hit home. His posture changed. Gone was the relaxed composure he had walked in with. In its place, stiffness, restraint, a calculated stillness. No more glances across the room. Certainly no more nods to the jury. Whether rattled or simply determined not to repeat the mistake, it was clear he now understood. He was under the microscope. The defense knew they had to tread carefully. They had to acknowledge the judge's authority without feeding into the disruption. During a short recess, the lead attorney approached the bench, speaking in measured, respectful tones. The conversation wasn't audible, but multiple sources later reported that the defense assured the judge their client fully understood the gravity of the situation and would strictly adhere to courtroom protocol from here on out. This wasn't just a formality. It was a strategic move to reestablish decorum, to rebuild the subtle trust that had been momentarily shaken. Importantly, the defense made no appeal to the jury. That would have risked reinforcing the very issue they needed to downplay. Instead, they chose quiet professionalism, letting their actions, not their words, signal how seriously they were taking the situation. It was a balancing act. They had to protect Diddy's image without challenging the court's authority, and all the while prevent the jury from interpreting the nod as something more calculated than it may have been. When proceedings resumed, the tension had eased slightly. The courtroom, at least on the surface, was back in order. But the trial had unmistakably changed. The moment had passed, but it would not be forgotten. Jurors are trained to weigh evidence, not emotion. But they're human. And in high-profile cases like this, every moment is magnified. They weren't just deciding a verdict, they were participating in a trial the world was watching. That kind of visibility creates a unique pressure. They knew it. Diddy knew it. His defense certainly did too. The nod itself could be interpreted in countless ways. Some jurors might have seen it as a sign of respect or acknowledgement. Others could perceive it as a subtle attempt to sway them, a calculated act of influence masked as humanity. And therein lies the danger. In the courtroom, perception often walks hand in hand with truth. In another high-profile trial, a witness's frequent glances toward jurors became a talking point, raising concerns about whether subtle body language could be used to shape outcomes. In yet another case, a defendant's casual demeanor led jurors to question their sincerity. Diddy's nod now entered that same gray area, a seemingly small gesture with potentially major implications. Experts in courtroom behavior and body language weighed in. Some saw it as a reflex, others as a deliberate attempt to connect. Regardless of intent, the act was now part of the case's narrative. And in celebrity trials, that narrative matters. Every blink, every sigh, and every glance is dissected. Defendants must walk a near impossible tightrope, appear composed but not cold, human but not manipulative. For Diddy, that balance had just been upset. The jurors may not talk about it, but the image of that nod will likely remain with them. It could subtly influence how they view Diddy, not just as a defendant, but as a person. And whether they realize it or not, that influence could shape how they interpret every piece of evidence that follows. Celebrity trials demand something more from jurors. They must evaluate facts while tuning out a cultural storm. In this setting, even the smallest of moments can shift the entire trajectory of a case. Diddy's nod was no longer just a moment. It had become a symbol of humanity, of miscalculation, of pressure. What made it even more perilous was how close it brought Diddy to the edge. Had the judge interpreted the nod as an act of juror tampering or disrespect, the consequences could have been severe. Removal from the courtroom, even temporarily, can destabilize a defense strategy and erode a defendant's presence in the eyes of the jury. That absence can leave a vacuum. Jurors begin to fill in the blanks. It's happened before. In one notorious case, a defendant's repeated outbursts led to their expulsion from the courtroom. Jurors were never quite the same afterward. The trial lost its balance, and the verdict reflected it. While Diddy's gesture didn't rise to that level, the warning he received was clear, and the weight of that near miss visibly affected him. This trial was already a crucible of public scrutiny. Now it had become a test of personal restraint. That nod, however small, was a crack in the image his team had carefully constructed. It showed just how fragile the facade of control can be when the world is watching. Celebrity trials are uniquely unforgiving. Mistakes aren't just documented, they're magnified. Diddy, already carrying the burden of public expectation, had learned that lesson in real time. From here on, every gesture he makes will be viewed not just as behavior, but as a statement, intention, or strategy. This trial was never just about facts and legal arguments. It was also about perception, identity, and legacy. Diddy isn't just fighting for a verdict. He's fighting for how he'll be remembered.